Hey there, and welcome back to the deep dive. Step into the stable with us today because we're taking a close look at a specific, um, sometimes puzzling behavior you might see in domestic horses. It's called weaving.
Yeah, it's something that can be really concerning for owners and, well, often quite misunderstood. For this deep dive, we've looked at expert guides, vet resources, even some materials for vet exam prep.
Hmm.
So, a pretty solid base.
Right, so our mission today is really to get past the assumptions, understand what weaving actually is, figure out the complex reasons behind it, see how it affects the horse, and really importantly, explore what the experts recommend for managing and ideally preventing it. We're pulling out the key stuff from all these sources.
Absolutely. And I think, the first step is getting a really clear picture of the behavior itself. Like, what does it actually look like?
Okay, let's unpack that. The sources are pretty specific. They define weaving as a locomotor stereotypy.
Which sounds pretty technical, right?
It does. But basically, it's this repetitive, rhythmic swaying.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the head, the neck, the whole front end kind of sways side to side.
And the horse shifts its weight back and forth between those front legs.
Exactly. And sometimes they might even lift their front feet right off the ground as they sway.
Got it. So that's steady back and forth motion. And the sources make a really critical point here. This is seen as a stable vice or an abnormal repetitive behavior because, well, it's tied to domestic life. You just don't see this in wild horses.
That's a huge clue right there, isn't it? It's
Yeah,
something that comes from being kept in stalls or managed environments.
precisely. Which leads us straight to the core idea. Weaving isn't random. It basically comes from inadequate conditions, chronic stress, frustration. At its heart, it's a coping mechanism. The horse is trying to cope with an environment that just isn't working for its natural instincts.
A coping mechanism for an unsuitable environment.
Yeah.
Yeah, that really changes how you think about it versus just a bad habit. And the sources emphasize it's multifactorial, lots of things contributing.
Exactly right. Not just one trigger, but the ones everyone agrees on, the main drivers are those environmental factors.
Okay, let's zero in on those. What is it about the domestic setup that triggers this?
Well, confinement and just restricted movement are massive. Horses are, built to move. They naturally graze, travel miles.
For hours a day, right?
Yeah, many hours. So being stuck in a stall, especially if it's small, it just directly frustrates that core need. Leads to boredom, frustration. Stall size itself is mentioned as a factor.
And they're such social creatures, too.
Fundamentally social, yes. So social isolation, not being able to see or touch other horses, that causes real anxiety and stress. Think about where you often see it happen.
Near the stall door or window.
Exactly. Which strongly suggests the horse is looking for connection, maybe trying to escape, trying to relieve that feeling of being alone. The sources mention, trying goats or donkeys as companions.
It's not the same.
No, another horse is really what they need for proper social contact.
So lack of space, lack of friends. What about feeding? How does that play in?
Limited foraging opportunities, that's another big piece. A horse's natural way is to graze almost constantly, little bits all the time.
Trickle feeding, basically.
Right, so feeding infrequent, large meals of concentrates, instead of having constant access to hay or pasture, that goes totally against their nature. It adds to the frustration and maybe even causes digestive upset, adding another layer of stress.
And it sounds like this stress can begin really early in life.
Yes, the sources really highlight weaning practices. If weaning is abrupt or stressful or done too early, it can make a young horse more likely to develop stereotypies like weaving down the line. It sort of sets them up for it.
Okay, so that's the environment pressing in. But what's happening inside the horse? The neurobiology sounds fascinating.
Yeah, this is where we get into the brain's response. The thinking is the behavior itself might be the horse trying to kind of self-soothe, regulate its internal state. All that chronic stress from the environment seems to mess with the dopamine system.
Dopamine, the reward chemical. So you're saying the actual act of weaving might release dopamine.
That's a key theory from the sources, yeah. The repetitive movement might give a small internal hit, which then makes the behavior self-reinforcing. It becomes compulsive.
So it gets wired in.
Pretty much. And this is why it's so tricky. The sources note that once these brain changes happen, the weaving can continue even if you take away the original stressor. It becomes ingrained.
Wow. So it starts as coping, but then the brain chemistry kind of takes over.
Yeah.
And you mentioned it might temporarily lower stress signs like heart rate.
Right. It might offer a brief physiological break in the moment, but, and this is crucial, it doesn't fix the underlying problem. The stressor that started it all is likely still there.
And it often gets worse when they expect something,
Right.
like feeding.
Exactly. You often see it ramp up just before feeding or before being turned out, which suggests it's also a way they handle that heightened emotion, that arousal or anticipation. The repetitive motion helps manage it.
Environment, neurobiology. Is there a genetic angle too? Are some horses just more prone?
Yeah, there's evidence pointing that way. The sources specifically mention thoroughbreds as a breed where it seems more common. It could be tied to temperament, maybe being naturally more reactive to stress, or just an inherited tendency towards these behaviors under pressure. You see it cluster in families sometimes, which supports that genetic link, even if we haven't found a specific weaving gene.
Interesting. Now, one source mentioned horses might learn it from each other, but there seemed to be some disagreement or nuance there.
There is a bit of nuance. One source does float the idea that maybe sometimes a horse could pick it up by watching another, especially if they're stalled right next to each other. But it's really important to stress that the main guides, the expert consensus in the material we looked at, heavily emphasizes those environmental, stress-related, and neurobiological factors as the fundamental reasons why a horse starts weaving in the first place.
Okay, so the learning by watching idea is out there, but the real weight of evidence points to the deeper issues. The stress, the environment, the brain changes, not just copying.
Exactly. It's good to acknowledge all the points raised in the sources, but understand where the primary focus lies based on the expert material.
All right, so we got a good handle on what it is and the complex why behind it. So what does this actually mean for the horse? What are the consequences?
Well, the main sign you see is that rhythmic side-to-side sway, usually near the stall door or window, like we said. And it often gets worse when they're stressed or waiting for something. That's the picture.
And it's not just a harmless quirk. It actually takes a toll on their health.
Oh, definitely. There are real physical consequences. If a horse is spending hours weaving, they're not eating. So that can lead to weight loss, poor body condition.
And just the physical motion itself must be wearing over time.
It really is. All that constant effort can cause muscle fatigue, soreness, potentially even tying up in really severe cases. And think about the hooves and joints.
Uneven wear, stress on the legs.
Exactly. Constant weight shifting puts uneven wear on hooves and shoes, and it puts a lot of strain on those forelimb joints. Over the long term, that can definitely contribute to lameness or arthritis.
Dehydration was mentioned too. How does that fit?
Just from the increased activity level, more movement means more potential water loss, especially if they aren't drinking enough to compensate. Plus, there can be some cardiovascular strain from the ongoing effort.
What about digestive problems? We often associate cribbing with things like ulcers, but weaving.
It's a bit different. The sources make a distinction. Weaving itself doesn't seem to directly cause digestive issues like cripping might, swallowing air. But, and this is key, the underlying causes of weaving, like chronic stress and maybe disrupted feeding schedules, those are major risk factors for gastric ulcers and other gut problems. So the link is indirect via those shared root causes.
Makes sense. And beyond the horse's physical health, there are practical issues too, right? For management, economics.
For sure. It might not be as destructive as cripping sometimes, but constant weaving can cause wear and tear on stall floors, walls. And unfortunately, an established weaver often has a lower market value.
And finding boarding can be tough sometimes.
It can. Some barns are reluctant, maybe just because it doesn't look good, or because of that lingering, though unproven, fear that other horses might copy it. It's a shame. But owners can definitely face some judgment or difficulty.
Okay, so if you suspect a horse is weaving, how do vets officially diagnose it?
Well, the main thing is direct observation. Just watching the horse and confirming it's that specific rhythmic sway and weight shift. You want to make sure it's not something else, like just head nodding or pacing back and forth.
And then a vet would dig deeper.
Yeah, a proper workup is important. Starts with observation, but then a really detailed history. How often does it happen? How long? When? Where? What triggers it? And then digging into their whole life story. Stall size, turnout time, who their neighbors are, what they eat, when they eat, any recent changes, even going back to how they were weaned.
So building that whole picture of their life and potential stress points.
Exactly. Then comes the physical exam. Checking hooves for that uneven wear, feeling limbs and joints for soreness or swelling, looking at muscle tone, body condition, hydration. Also important to rule out any neurological problems that could cause weird movements.
Any other tests? Blood work? X-rays?
Sometimes, but only if something specific points that way. Like if you suspect muscle damage, maybe check muscle enzymes in the blood. Or if the horse seems lame, maybe radiographs or ultrasound of the affected joints to look for damage from the repetitive stress. But not usually routine.
And the most critical diagnostic tool, according to the sources.
The environmental assessment, actually going and looking at the horse's daily reality, the stall, the turnout, the social situation, the feeding setup. You have to evaluate the environment to find the stressors that are likely driving the behavior. That's fundamental.
Okay, diagnosis made. Now the really hard part, managing weaving once it's established. The sources suggest this is, well, tough.
It really is, because it's often so deeply ingrained, maybe even wired into their brain chemistry by that point. Completely stopping it is rare. The goal is usually more about reducing how often and how intensely they do it, and it needs a multi-pronged approach.
Right. No single quick fix. So what are the core strategies? What works best?
Environmental and behavioral changes. This is number one, across the board in the sources. Changing the horse's world to better meet its natural needs is the absolute most critical thing.
Which brings us right back to getting them out of the stall. Turnout.
Yes. Maximizing turnout is consistently highlighted as the single biggest impact intervention. As much as possible, ideally 247 on pasture with buddies. That lets them move, graze, socialize. It hits all those core needs that were likely unmet.
And if 257 isn't possible, increasing social contact is still vital.
Absolutely vital. Visual contact, physical contact if possible. Even for stalled horses, making sure they can see and interact with others helps immensely. The sources mention mirrors. Maybe they help a little for a horse completely alone, but it's a very poor substitute for real horse company.
What about making the stall itself better? Enrichment.
Yes, providing things to do. Visual enrichment like windows, maybe some sturdy stall toys, treat balls, slow feeders to make hay last longer. Anything to combat boredom and frustration, and just generally keeping things calm and predictable, consistent routine, quiet environment, gentle handling, making any changes slowly. Minimize extra stress.
More space, more friends, more to do, less stress.
Got it.
What about diet during management?
Diet is also really important, especially focusing on forage. The recommendation is basically free choice, high-quality hay or pasture, 247 if possible.
Keeps them chewing, mimics grazing.
Exactly. Supports gut health, too, which stress can impact. Slow feed nets are great for making hay last longer and keeping them occupied.
And cutting back on grain.
Yeah, minimizing or ideally cutting out those high-starch, sugary concentrate feeds. If they need extra calories, go for low-starch, high-fiber options and feed them in small, frequent meals. And of course, always fresh water.
Okay, now the sources also mention some things that are well, less recommended, like physical barriers,
Yeah.
anti-weave bars.
Right. Things like grills you put across the top of the stall door. The sources are really clear on these. Generally not recommended. They physically stop the weaving, sure, but they do absolutely nothing about why the horse is doing it.
And they probably increase stress.
They often do. And the horse might just switch to a different stereotypy, like pacing or starting to crib. So yeah, the advice is generally to avoid them.
What about medication? Any drugs that can stop it?
It's rarely a cure on its own. Drugs might be considered as a temporary measure in really severe cases, maybe to help manage extreme anxiety or try to break the cycle, but the effects usually don't last. Things like anxiolytics are mentioned, maybe some drugs acting on dopamine or opioid systems, but the research specifically for weaving isn't as extensive as for cribbing. Some people try nutritional supplements like magnesium or L-tryptophan for anxiety, but results are pretty variable.
And surgery. There's no weaving operation like there is for cribbing.
Nope. The sources are explicit. No surgical options exist for weaving, which really reinforces that it's fundamentally about behavior, environment, stress, and brain function, not something you can physically cut out or fix surgically.
So managing established weaving is a long game, often about reducing it, not eliminating it. What's the general outlook, the prognosis?
It varies a lot. Weaving is often chronic once it really takes hold. But the good news is its severity can often be significantly reduced sometimes to where it's barely an issue if you can successfully implement those big management changes, especially around environment.
So success really hinges on being able to provide more turnout, social contact.
Exactly. If you can make those significant environmental improvements, the prognosis is better. If the weaving is really severe, has been going on for years, or has already caused physical problems like joint issues, the prognosis is naturally more guarded.
Managing it is so challenging and often requires such fundamental changes to the horse's life. It really highlights where the focus should be, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Prevention. Stopping it before it even starts is by far the most effective approach.
And how do we do that? What are the key prevention strategies?
It really starts right from the beginning with how young horses are managed. Things like low-stress weaning, doing it gradually, maybe in groups, making sure foals get plenty of opportunity for social interaction and play early on.
And designing their environment right from the start.
Critically important. Providing enough space, maximizing turnout from a young age, designing barns and stalls so horses can see and ideally touch each other. Introducing enrichment early, too, getting them used to having things to interact with.
And diet from day one.
Yes, establishing that pattern of high forage, low concentrate feeding early on, ensuring they always have access to forage, mimicking that natural grazing behavior as much as possible throughout their life.
And just minimizing stress across the board.
It's a constant theme, isn't it? Avoiding sudden changes in routine, diet, social groups whenever you can. Just trying to keep their world as stable and stress-free as possible.
And maybe considering genetics, given that potential link.
Yeah, the sources suggest being mindful of that, maybe avoiding breeding horses from lines where weaving is known to be prevalent, acknowledging that potential predisposition.
So wrapping this all up, it's crystal clear that weaving isn't just some annoying habit or a personality quirk.
Not at all. It's complex. It's deeply rooted in the horse's fundamental needs for space, for company, for the right kind of food and activity not being met. It's driven by stress, isolation, confinement, and it can even lead to lasting changes in the brain.
And the main message, the big takeaway for anyone listening, whether they're trying to prevent it or manage it.
It's that the solution lies in meeting the horse's ethological needs, providing management that respects their nature. Space, friends, forage, low stress. That's how you prevent it. And that's the foundation for managing it, because once it starts, it's incredibly difficult to fully reverse. Things like physical barriers or just relying on drugs, they miss the point entirely because they don't fix the root cause.
What really strikes you after going through all this material? For me, it's just how powerfully this one behavior signals a mismatch between the animal's inherent nature and the way we often keep them.
I completely agree. It's such a clear illustration of how profoundly environment shapes behavior and well-being. And maybe this deep dive leaves you, the listener, with a question to ponder. If stress and environment can have such deep, potentially lasting effects on an animal's behavior like we see with weaving, what does that tell us more broadly about our responsibility? Our responsibility to create environments where the animals in our care can truly flourish, not just, get by or survive.
Definitely something important to think about. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.